Welcome to It's Your Ego, Stupid, a show lovingly intended for millions of spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people like you who may at times be led into ego stupidity, a lesser version of yourself and a lesser version of life. This show will give you a much deeper understanding of what ego is, what it's doing to your life, how it can weaken your human and spiritual wellness, and how you can heal in each of these areas if needed. It's Your Ego, Stupid will heighten your awareness of the intense link between your ego and spirit, your humanity and divinity, and the synergy that can lead to the best version of you and your life. Your host is Dr. Nick Martin, a licensed psychologist who has worked in the clinical, university, school, and private practice settings over the past 40 years, while serving as a therapist, diagnostician, educator, and consultant. Welcome again to It's Your Ego, Stupid. And now your host, Dr. Nick Martin.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Martin, and thank you for listening to It's Your Ego, Stupid. As the intro said, this is a program lovingly intended for spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people, just like you and me, who may at times be led by our ego into something I call ego stupidity, a lesser version of ourselves, and a lesser version of life. Ego stupidity that is affecting the relationship we have with our husband, wife, or partner. Perhaps it's impacting our relationship with our son or daughter, or maybe our brother or sister, and can even be happening with ourselves. Ego stupidity that can make it difficult for us to achieve, to make use of our potential, to climb the ladder of success, and to experience a sense of meaning and purpose to our life. Ego stupidity that can make it difficult to deal effectively with all of the inevitable change, adversity, stress, or conflicts that happen in all of our lives. And finally, ego stupidity that's making it difficult to feel genuine happiness and can often lead us into unneeded or inappropriate anxiety, anger, guilt, sadness, or something I call fake happiness, which is actually pleasure-based happiness masquerading for the real thing. If things aren't going well, or perhaps as well as you'd like, you've come to the right place. Because a lot of what's going wrong in our lives, or perhaps not as well as we would like it to go, has much to do with our ego energy, which is the fuel for ego stupidity. It's often the unseen and unrecognized source of what's going wrong in our life, both humanly and spiritually. These are lessons I've learned from thousands of people, just like you, over the past 40 years. You've taught me with your lives, your relationships, and your experiences, what theorists, books, or schools of psychology could not teach me about ego. You have been my teachers. Again, I want to thank you for joining me for today's program, in which we will continue to look at ego stupidity and its impact on our life story. As you may recall, we've been looking at some of the really important areas that seem to be areas that make or break the quality of our life, and whether it's going to feel poor, fair, perhaps good, and even great. These are really important areas. We mentioned some of them, and we've looked at these previously. A few of them involved our ability to love ourselves, our ability to form close relationships with loved ones, as well as the ability to grow our mind. During today's program, we're going to be looking at a few of these other important life areas. These are, like as I said, chapters of our life story, and we are writing in each of these chapters with our thoughts and with our words and our behaviors what's going on inside of that chapter and how well we're able to experience the best of what life has to offer within them. So during today's program, we're going to be taking a look at a few of these new other areas. The first one we'll be looking at involves the various changes that we are all called upon to deal with in our life. Changes that can involve our development or the development of loved ones, changes that are going on around us in society, changes of a technological nature that we're having to wrestle with, as well as situational changes that can be going on. A little later, we're going to be going into looking at adversity and how we are able to face the different failures that we may encounter or the kinds of losses that we may experience and the mistakes that we make. All of these inevitably occurring due to our human imperfection. And finally, we're going to be taking a look at the chapter that involves stress and stressors. These are the kind of stressors that many people have to face. We all face, actually, be they work-related stressors or finance-related stressors. Some are family-related stressors, and even those connected to health. As I said before, each of these areas, apart from being chapters in our life story, we can also think of them as mirrors. These are mirrors in which we can look in order to get to know the kind of ego energy that we are using to manage our life, for better or perhaps for worse. So we're going to start by looking at the mirror involving our ability to manage life changes. And I guess I want to start by talking about what makes this such an important life area. Why have you taught me that this is really important in the story of our life? Well, change is something that is going on constantly. It's happening in our life, and undergirding this change is energy. That energy is playing its role in what's happening in our life. And this energy can affect the way we manage change, or the way our failure to manage the change, our failure to manage this energy, can often lead to a failure to managing life, and perhaps falling further and further behind what's going on. It's like we start to get out of touch with what's going on. And this distance that we can start to get into can involve things that involve the areas of human development, our development, as I said, perhaps the development that's taking place in our children. One of the things that we have to wrestle with, perhaps if we have children, is as they move forward in their life, if they go on into becoming adolescents, there's a lot of change, as you probably know, that is going on. They can be identity-related changes, as the great theorist Erickson referred to, changes that involve the physical aspects of their identity, the social aspects, the vocational, the sexual, the religious, all of these different portions of their identity that are changes that are beginning to occur and that we are called upon to manage involving them. We can be wrestling with situational changes that are taking place. Perhaps we've had a work-related change, or perhaps a relationship-related change, or maybe financial changes, things that maybe we weren't expected. Some of the changes, they are maybe smaller, maybe a little more easily dealt with, and some of them are larger, some that can be seemingly overwhelming and unmanageable. The same can be whether we expected these changes, can be a variable that affects how we respond to the change. Some are expected and some are unexpected. With the advent of the coronavirus, we are getting two changes. We're getting fast change and we're getting unexpected change. And that is creating a lot of challenge for us to have to work with and deal with. Other changes that are going on are societal changes that are taking place. We've seen tremendous change in the way our societies are operating, the social norms that have changed. Certainly over my lifetime, we've had to wrestle with important changes involving black rights and women's rights and gay rights and many, many more in order to optimize the benefits of the change that was occurring. We're also dealing with technological change. The whole computerization process that started unfolding over the last 30 years since the early 90s, that's represented challenges for many people to adapt to and to work with the changes that are occurring. I can remember almost in a humoral light people from my generation, the baby boomer generation, in how we work with cell phones and how I would joke with some of my peers about at school, college, that where I was teaching, about how we had caught on to texting and how to text and all that kind of stuff. Whereas young people who grew up with this stuff from almost seemingly their infancy were well equipped to work with that technological change. So there is lots of change that's going on. And when we fail to manage the change, this often results in the change managing us. And this is happening whether we like it or not. So we are challenged to work with change, and if we work with it, better things can often happen. Whereas if we fail to manage it, the change is still happening, whether we like it or not, and it's going to maybe affect us in ways that we don't want it to affect us. We can start living in a world, or trying to live in a world that once was, the world of the past, rather than the world of the present where we need to be. And we fail to live in the world that is at the present time, leaving us falling further and further behind. When we fail to manage change, we can be failing to strike a balance between traditions and progress. Traditions and progress. Traditions are those things that we have acquired over time from our own cultural backgrounds or religious backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds and so on, that have been maybe good things that we needed to learn and make use of to help us. Now, there also have been some unhealthy traditions that have occurred that we maybe have to think about discarding. I've looked at these kinds of traditions, whether it's in the world, the larger world, genital mutilation was a tradition that was often used in other parts of the world for, affecting females, and that was a change that was harmful and that was a tradition that was harmful and destructive that we needed to have people recognize it for what it was, hazing for fraternities. What a change that needs to be done, because young people are getting harmed and some are dying as a result of hazing. So there's change that needs to happen. There are traditions that are embracing that love and life and energy God is within them, when there are others that are just harmful and destructive. And another thing that can be happening when we don't work with change is we can miss out on the opportunities that life may be bringing us in the form of change. Sometimes when we're wrestling with or change through the ego energy, it blocks us from really seeing the change for what its potential is, what it can lend itself to. So those are some aspects of change that make it a really important area of our life to come to terms with and to work with. And there are times when we may be failing to do that. And right now I want to talk about some of the reflections of ego stupidity that can be occurring and where ego can be having an effect in this area. In some cases, people may ignore or try to passively accept change, maybe treat it like it's not happening. That's usually a lower ego power or low ego power energy issue going on. It's as if the change is unable to be effectively dealt with through one's own ego power. So the best thing I can come up with is to pretend that it's not happening, or to not work with it, but just to accept that it's happening, but in a passive way. On the other side of that, sometimes people attempt to aggressively manage change, meaning that they interpret the change as a threat to the power, the control, or the influence that may be taking place in their life. And they have a need to push it away, to try to undo it, so to speak, if they can, because by doing so, they feel like they can retain the sense of control going on. Some people act like dictators in their families, and their children are changing, and they don't like those changes that are happening in them, particularly as they become adolescents. So they feel the need to push back against any change going on. And there's a lot of friction and tension, and that begins to occur in families as a result of ineffective ways to deal with change. Also, people may have difficulty, a reflection of ego stupidity is when people have difficulty recognizing the need for progress, that there is a need for new things and to do things in better and more effective ways than may have been the case previously, that there can be lessons learned. When we think about energy, when we think about change, it's part of evolution. And evolution is geared to making things healthier and better. And so incorporating those aspects of evolution, those shifts in energy, can be important. But sometimes people don't want to deal with progress, and they want to blunt its being a part of what's going on in their world, in their life. Another reflection of ego stupidity is when people begin to reject social change and technological change. I think of people with lower ego flexibility or low ego flexibility who are highly rooted in their conceptions of what is the truth about the way things should be. And the way things should be is the way they've always been in their own minds, and failing to realize that there are things that we need to work with and open up to that can provide a better existence than the one we had been in. You think of the Archie Bunker mode of looking at change. I didn't want to see change happening, whether it involved African Americans in our society, or women in our society, or gay individuals in our society. Very closed-minded, and a lot of ego stupidity taking place. Another quick reflection is when people may be having difficulty accepting career-related changes in their spouse or their partner. Their spouse is opening up to more possibilities, particularly maybe as their children leave the home and they have the opportunity to do new things or use more of their potential, and perhaps one of the partners or the husband or the wife isn't open up to that possibility and begin to have difficulties occurring in the relationship that aren't necessary if people are more open-minded and working with the change that's going on. So these are just some reflections of ego stupidity occurring within the confines of dealing with change. And as we come up on our first break, I want you to think about this question, which is, does any of this describe what's happening to you or perhaps somebody that you know? Some of the time, or perhaps a lot of the time? We're going to go to our first break. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid. This is Dr. Nick, and I'll see you after the break.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Being a radio host on IOM-FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Did you know that you have the power to change anything in your life? Did you know you can do so even with the things that you've already decided are impossible to change? Come join me, Venus Castleberg, on Outside the Impossible as I interview people from around the globe that have literally changed the things they thought were impossible to change just by using the amazing tools of Access Consciousness. Now airing Wednesdays 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. Do you dare to believe that anything really is possible?
Hi, Dr. Nick Martin here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page where you can find each of my other books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, and The Two Voices Within.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. This is Dr. Nick. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid, a program for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. We're going to continue talking about some of the important life areas that are part of our life story. In particular, during this portion of the show, we're going to talk about adversity, our ability to manage adversity, the things that happen that maybe go wrong, things that may come in the form of our failings, our failures, the losses that we may encounter in our life, the mistakes that we make. And the question is, well, why is this an important life area? What's so important about this? And I guess the answer has something to do with life success, has something to do with how well we cope with life failures. And the life failures are going to happen partly because we are humanly imperfect. We are all imperfect, and due to that imperfection, things can happen that we don't want to happen, but they are part of life. And it's the manner in which we can learn to respond to these failures, to these losses, to these mistakes. It's going to have a profound effect upon the amount of career success that we are going to experience, financial success, perhaps family success, what's going on inside of our family and how we deal with maybe the mistakes that we make, that we need to own up to and learn from, to grow from. Health success, working with our bodies and treating them well so that we can enjoy a healthy, perhaps long-term life existence. Marital success, the things that happen inside of marriages that can bring them down if we don't learn from the mistakes that we were making, mistakes that may involve communication or compromise and creativity and so on, that are part of the process of growing a relationship that people may be failing to do. And these are just some of the areas of life that are being affected by how well we manage adversity. Being a winner or a loser in life often has a lot to do with how well we respond to adversity. It's sort of like we become hopefully a life skill is becoming a failure management expert. A failure management expert, somebody who's able to identify things that need to be done. In my book, Ego Therapy, I talk about 3 things, and we're not going to be able to go into great depth here, but I talk about problem appraisal, which is just the idea of figuring out what led to the problem happening or what are some of the reasons that the problem happened. I talk about responsibility appraisal, which has to do with being able to own the portion of the problem that was created that maybe we're supposed to own, that we're supposed to be able to recognize we played a role in doing, something that a lot of people have difficulty with, responsibility appraisal. And then there's also solution appraisal, which is figuring out, okay, what needs to be done, what needs to be taken care of. Another part of this process of being a failure management expert. So it's problem appraisal, responsibility appraisal, and solution appraisal, all of which can be affected by the ego energy that we are. And I'm going to be talking about some of the reflections of this a little bit later. And part of the business of, again, being a winner or a loser in our life has to do with how well we can respond to adversity. The winners tend to be the people who deal with adversity. They get knocked over. They learn from their mistakes. They grow from their mistakes. They get up and they get on with it. And the sooner that we can learn that failure is part of the journey to success rather than something to be avoided, the sooner that our life can be filled with success. So failure is part of the journey to success. And many times people, if their ego energy is not in the right place or in a healthy place, can be consumed with failure. We're going to talk a little bit about people with lower ego power who maybe fail to work with taking on challenges after they've failed because they don't want to repeat them, or people who are experiencing higher ego vulnerability who are feeling stressed out by the possibility of making the next mistake. So they tend to underachieve as a result. So being able to respond to getting knocked over and learning from and owning our mistakes are really important life skills. And many successful people can tell you stories, lots of stories that are filled with that. They have funny, humorous stories that can tell us about their journey and about how they learned that. I remember a few years back I was watching a video, and the video was a presentation by the late and great basketball coach for North Carolina State, Jim Valvano. And he was speaking to a conference of business leaders out at in Chicago, and it was called the $1 Million Roundtable. And Coach was talking for about an hour about the process and the journey that he had been on that ultimately led to his having won a national championship with North Carolina State. I think it was 1983 when they defeated a very good Houston team with Akeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler on it, known as Phi Slamma Jamma, an incredible feat on his part. But during this presentation, he talked about some of the failures that happened along the way to his successes. And he talked about having been hired as a coach and having gone, and he was going to meet with the boosters, but he went to the wrong state. He went to Greensboro, South Carolina, rather than Greensboro, North Carolina. And he began to think, boy, they're going to think a whole lot less of me for failing to make it even to the right state. And he also told a story about a pep talk that he had planned to give to his team before a big game that was inspired from having listened to Vince Lombardi talk to his team, the Green Bay Packers, and he punctuated the end of the talk by saying, "Men, there are only 3 important things in your life. They are your family, your religion, and the Green Bay Packers." So Coach Valvano decided that he thought that would be a good way to punctuate his speech, his pep talk to the team, but he kind of left out one thing. He gets to the end of the pep talk and he says, "Men, I just want you to know there are only 3 important things in your life: your family, your religion, and the Green Bay Packers." And he talked about how the basketball players just looked at him like, "What are you talking about?" And then they just, had to leave the locker room in a weird state, to go onto the floor for that game. But failure is so much a part of the journey, and we shouldn't be friends with it. We should be good at making mistakes with it or making friends with it. And that's something that when people have a healthy ego energy, they can do. Their power issues are not in the way. Their flexibility issues are not in the way. Their vulnerability issues are not in the way. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the reflections of ego stupidity and ego's impact, meaning the kind of power, flexibility, or vulnerability issues that can be leading to that. For some people, they may tend to minimize or ignore problems until they get bigger, meaning they tend to just want to pretend that the problem isn't really there. Maybe it's a health problem. I've seen this happen a lot particularly with males who have and part of it is because they are providers and they cannot, or they historically have been the primary provider. And they have a difficult time acknowledging that maybe there's something going on medically, and maybe they get help later rather than sooner when it would be important. Time is sometimes of the essence, and it's important to deal with a problem at a size when it's more manageable, which tends to be earlier on. But unfortunately, some people may have a difficult time addressing problems. They could be financial problems, they could be health problems, they can be relationship problems, and they just keep festering, and the person wants to believe there's really not a problem with our communication, or there's really not a problem, even though I'm experiencing physical problems like angina, in my chest, pressure buildup and pain, and just thinking nothing of it. And just other reflections. And this is kind of ego stupidity at work in some cases. Higher ego power. It's as if I acknowledge the problem, I'm giving into it. You've probably heard that. People just want to feel like they're not giving into the problem, that they're bigger than the problem is. In this case, it might be a medical problem. Or maybe they're, a financial area that needs to be addressed and worked with, a better balance in the budgeting process, and instead of getting into tremendous amounts of debt that isn't good, they ignore that. So our ego stupidity, ego power related issues can be doing that. Sometimes we can fail to keep problems in perspective. We can make them out to be smaller than they are, which is kind of what I said in the first thing. Or we can make them out to be bigger than they are. Sometimes we can enlarge the problem. We can begin to think that it's something greater than it is. And this is the kind of thing that can happen when people have what I call higher ego vulnerability energy. When people feel very vulnerable, this is something I can see in myself. I remember many years ago having had some stomach problems, and the first place I started to look was in a Merck manual. I think I've said before how that can be not good for people like me in my earlier life, because you begin to take a symptom, and before you know it, you have every condition listed in that book. And and that was due to my higher ego vulnerability. I was probably caught up in a lot of fear-based thinking, anxiety-based thinking, and wasn't keeping my feet on the ground. And that can happen sometimes when people are caught up within that kind of energy, that they need to understand that it's really something that they're magnifying, that need to kind of get their perspective on. Sometimes we can fail, another reflection of ego stupidity. We fail to own our contribution to problems and mistakes. That goes back to what I call responsibility appraisal. And we look for someone or something else to blame. People that are very much into blaming other people and other things rather than owning up to this, to their contribution to difficulties. This can be a higher ego power energy thing, because if I have to admit that I'm contributing to this problem, then I have to acknowledge some degree of weakness in myself that allowed the problem to happen, and I'm into power. I'm into control. I'm not into owning weakness. So it becomes very important. And by the way, people who are doing this aren't consciously doing it. They don't know that they are misleading themselves as to who's responsible. They aren't, again, consciously doing this. This is not the way our ego energy operates. It's operating oftentimes out of our awareness, but it's still there. It's still operating. So people start to get caught up in blaming other people, and they do it a lot. It's like a habit almost, that anything that goes wrong, I can't touch it. Another reflection of ego stupidity sometimes happening is when people say, or when we fail to be willing to be part of the solution, if we didn't cause the problem. Some people take the approach that if I didn't start the problem or I didn't make the problem happen, I don't have to take any responsibility for helping to fix it. And it's as if they're sensitized to the connection of working with the problem as, in some respects, becoming known as the contributor to the problem. And people often have a difficult time allowing themselves to help, to be responsible for being a part of the solution. Sometimes people get into weird games when it comes to solving problems, which maybe they say, I won't do anything if you don't do anything. I won't take responsibility for the fixing the problem if you don't, or you have to go first before I do. That's another reflection of ego stupidity, often a higher ego power energy thing. Some people who also may be into higher ego vulnerability, who are very insecure in themselves, and maybe find it difficult to accept responsibility because that again infringes upon that desire to feel like they're not as weak as that would maybe be suggesting that they are. So that's another reflection of ego stupidity connected to dealing with adversity and failures and mistakes. I'm going to mention a couple more. We attack ourselves for having made mistakes. Sometimes people get all over themselves as a result of having made a mistake. They don't have permission to fail. They don't have permission to lose. They don't have permission to have a problem. I think that might have been some of my issues in my younger days. Is in my family, we didn't talk about problems a lot. It was as if problems were not permitted to occur. And unfortunately, that was not good. That was not healthy for me in my development to accept the fact that problems were, are allowed to happen. And I know that this kind of issue was connected to my some of my insecurity during my younger days. And I certainly now have given myself permission to have a problem if in fact I do have a problem. But in those times, that was a reflection of ego stupidity. It's not okay to have a problem. That's just a terrible idea, a terrible message. And one last thing, we may listen too much to the wrong people about how to fix the problem. Sometimes people with higher ego flexibility energy, they don't know who the right people to listen to about the right things at the right times in an effort to help work on and to solve the problem. They blindly, and they may be naively accepting that other people know best when in fact they don't know best. They're not looking at these people through their experiences. They're not looking at them through their expertise. And as a result, they can maybe take in and accept things that maybe they shouldn't. And these people can be members of their family. They can be having good intentions, but yet they may not be the right person. And yet the person who is with higher ego flexibility doesn't know it. And so they end up making use of strategies to work with things that may not be the best ones. So before we go on to our next break, I want you to ask yourself the question: does any of this describe you? Or perhaps somebody you know? Some of the time? Or perhaps a lot of the time? We're going to go to our next break. When we return, we're going to talk about our ability to manage stressors and stress. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid. This is Dr. Nick, and I'll see you after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
OMTimes magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Connect at OMTimes.com. OMTimes, creating a more conscious lifestyle.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
Hi, Dr. Nick here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page, where you can find focused ego meditations, that can help you know whether you are truly speaking with your voice in your life or ego is speaking for you.
Melissa from Michigan. I work an extra part-time job serving lunch at my child's school, but I still can't afford to put food on our table.
Daniel from California. Choosing whether to pay the rent or pay to fix the car to get to work doesn't leave us with much at all. Now we can't even pay for meals.
Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org. Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid, a program for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. As we go into this last portion of today's program, we're going to be looking at another important chapter of our life story, which has to do with our ability to manage stressors and stress. Stressors and stress. So you may ask, well, why is this an important life area? One of the things you may have heard has to do with the notion that stress is the silent killer. Stress is the silent killer. And I remember when I went through this discussion, this topic in my developmental psych class that I taught, we would look at health-related areas, and particularly those that could affect longevity. The mortality rates and the issues that connected stress and mortality and longevity involved stress. There is plenty of research on heart disease and cancer that indicate that stress is often at work. Stress that it's sort of working or building over time, not overnight, that we need to recognize the signs and symptoms of early on rather than later on in order to reduce the potential for succumbing to either of those two things, heart disease and cancer. I remember saying to my classes that when we were talking about this, I would put forth this sober notion that most people in this class, and there would be about 60 people there, would be, when they do pass on, which hopefully will be much later in their lives, these were only 20-year-olds, will die from heart disease and cancer. And that it would be important not to wait until you're in your 50s or 60s to pay attention to this, that this is something that really younger people in their 20s and 30s need to think about in regards to things like their diet and other activities that they may affect their bodies and their wellness, both from both a physical and a psychological standpoint. So there is plenty of research that shows that how we work with stress, how we understand it, how we manage it can have significant implications for our life, the quality of our life. And we do, unfortunately, have to confront stressors, and there are various kinds that affect us. There are various responsibilities. There are challenges that we are called on to meet in our busy daily lives. They can be work responsibilities that we have to deal with, or school-related challenges that we often have to deal with, or family-related responsibilities that they are pretty consistent. They're always there, and that we have to work with. And hope if we're being responsible parents, that is. If we're not, then it's probably not much of an issue. There are financial stressors that people have to work with and wrestle with. Many people are living from paycheck to paycheck, or now with the coronavirus, are seeing that come into question. There are obviously health stressors, and those are some of the big ones that we have to work with in order to deal effectively with stress and manage it. One of the things I remember sharing with my students, again, in that developmental psych course, which many times was consisting of nursing students because that was part of their requirement to take that particular course, and also the research on healthcare workers and things that people experience that cause them to succumb to stress. And I talked about how it was important to have a philosophy that could sort of underlie your efforts in your work to deal with stress. And I shared with them that mine was connected to St. Francis of Assisi, and that I had selected St. Francis of Assisi as my patron saint when I went through the sacrament of confirmation as a Catholic. And at that time, when I was about 13 years old, I didn't know much about him other than he kind of was in tune with nature, and there was a very peaceful presence in his bearing. And there was a prayer of St. Francis that begins with, "Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace." Again, "Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace." And I didn't know the rest of the whole writing, the prayer, but that struck me. And it struck me in a way that suggested that my responsibility, and it became part of my philosophy in working with people, my responsibility is to work as hard as I can with the tools that I have been given, with no guarantee about the outcomes of what will happen in my efforts to work with and to be helpful to people. And I shared that with the students with the understanding that there are going to be many times when they are going to be working very hard to serve others, and the outcomes are not going to be what they had hoped they would be, and that they cannot beat themselves up because it didn't go that way. That it was important to have a philosophy that respected the limits that we have, that in some cases we only have so much control over what goes on in life, and then life in the form of other people or other circumstances has that level of or part of the control. So it was important to work with it and to understand that if we were going to be serving others. And so sometimes when people are ignoring or denying or deluding themselves in response to them, it doesn't work very well. That is their ability to deal with stress or stressors. And that often leads us in a direction of ego stupidity. And that's why I refer to stress as the silent killer, because it's part of that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the reflections of ego stupidity that can start to make their appearance when it comes to stressors and stress. Again, some people may ignore the signs of stress or attempt to manage it later after it has been managing us and our lives. So sometimes if you interview people and you get a history of what's been going on, you'll find that they came to this awareness, this recognition much later rather than sooner, that the signs were showing up. Sometimes they were small, they were subtler, but then they began to increase and grow, and yet people were just continuing to ignore them. Again, that's probably the kind of thing you often see with people who are having high ego power issues, who view the stress or the stressor as a confrontation, as a challenge to the control they have, to the power they have, that they don't want to acknowledge. So they just push away any recognition of what those warning signals are. You know, your body's an incredible tool. Your mind's an incredible tool. It is telling us stuff. And if we don't listen to it, if we can't listen to it, we often pay the price later on. And that's an ego energy thing that causes us to overlook things, to miss things as a result. In some cases, we can magnify. The ego stupidity can be coming forth in magnifying stress symptoms or interpreting them as meaning something worse than they may be. Again, this gets into that higher ego vulnerability energy stuff. We can use our anxiety. We may be in fight or flight mode unknowingly, and we end up making something out to be larger when in fact, it may be normal. It may be something to be expected that people do experience. But it isn't the problem that's the problem, or the stressor that's the stressor. It's the management of the stressor that starts to be problematic, that's happening, and maybe we're doing some of the wrong things. If we take one pill to solve the problem, maybe 5 more would work better. And we start, using that kind of emotional thinking and failing to realize that there may be issues with regard to that game plan or strategy. Another thing that can often happen that reflects ego stupidity. Again, these are smart people. These are intelligent people. I was a smart person. I was an intelligent person. I was not a mentally ill person. But yet we get caught up in this ego stupidity. But we continue to feel stressed even though the stressor has been dealt with. Sometimes people with higher ego vulnerability have a difficult time with accepting that things are done, things are over in regards to the situation. It's been dealt with pretty well, and it's done. But sometimes the body continues to signal maybe there's something going on. And in my book, Ego Therapy, I also talk about how we can be a person that may have what's called primary ego vulnerability and secondary ego vulnerability. And again, that's not something I can go into much detail here, but the idea is that maybe we have a biological predisposition, and it makes us get into fight or flight much longer, or much faster, much easier, and we can stay in it much longer than we need to. That's just something that sometimes can happen in our workings with stress and stressors. It's as if we are stuck and we don't kind of update with the idea that, oh, the stressor's done. The financial stressor has been taken care of. Maybe it's a health-related stressor that has been dealt with, but we have a difficult time being able to shift and relax, to calm down. And that's for perhaps the things that we talked about last week about, I call them spiritual tools, but things like meditation and even prayer, mindfulness practice, perhaps use of humor in healthy ways. All of those things can help us work with that biology. I also mentioned that sometimes we have something called secondary ego vulnerability, and that has to do with we're conditioned to feel anxious. We're conditioned to feel nervous, even though we're not really in that situation. And as a result, we're stuck. We're stuck there. Now, sometimes ego stupidity involving stressors, and stress can involve something I just mentioned a little bit ago, that we can overdo our efforts to remove the stressor. We can attempt to do more than is necessary to work with the stressor. You've heard of the phrase overkill. Sometimes people get caught up in overkill, meaning that they use, instead of one strategy, they may use a combination of strategies. I can laughingly remember when I was dealing with high cholesterol in my earlier days, probably 25 years ago. I would try different things. Supposedly using aspirin regimen was good, and drinking red wine was good, and there were a few other things that were all intended to address this, but I didn't realize that sometimes maybe there's an interactional effect, that maybe you can't do all of that at the same time. Yet this was the anxiety-ridden thinking of my own, again, ego stupidity that just happens some of the time. So sometimes we overdo the efforts to solve the problem or to solve the stress that can actually create bigger stress. There's one more thing I will mention that has to do with ego stupidity, and it involves the idea that sometimes we can look for things to be stressed out about. We can look for things to be stressed out about. And what I mean by that is that sometimes some people can be so used to being stressed out that being in a state of relaxation or calm is unfamiliar to them. It's just unfamiliar. It's just like, it's weird for me to be relaxed. It's weird for me to be calm. And so they feel uncomfortable. So they maybe induce something to be stressed out about. Or in some cases, there can be nothing going on outside of us that's the source of stress. Yet that person looks for something to be wrong, failing to realize that maybe what's going on inside of them, their biology has led them to be connected to looking for things outside. They don't understand the biology at work that may be causing them to feel a little more anxious or tense than they should be feeling, and they start looking for reasons outside of themselves. And sometimes we can be very good at finding those reasons. So that's another reflection of ego stupidity. So as we leave this last key life area, this part of our life story, this mirror, I leave you with this question. Does this describe you, or perhaps somebody you know, some of the time or a lot of the time? We have reached the end of today's program. I hope that what I've shared with you involving ego stupidity and where it can be happening in your life story will serve as a dose of ego medicine. And also, if what I've shared with you during this program resonates with you, please help me to share it with others. Next week, we're going to complete our discussion of the important chapters of our life story and how they can be used to start tuning into our ego energy, as well as uncovering any of the ego stupidity that is happening despite your being a spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect person. We are also going to take a look at what genuine happiness looks like. We're going to be looking actually how we can work with and manage conflict, as well as how we can learn to experience genuine happiness. And we'll also be talking about a consciousness I referred to as ego spiritualism. I want to thank you for listening to today's program and allowing me to be your servant. I want you to have a great week, and please come back to my next program. In peace and love, this is Dr. Nick saying goodbye for now.